Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something pretty heavy.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all ears.
So today, we're going deep, really deep, into the Russia-Ukraine war.
Still so much to unpack there.
You guys sent in some incredible sources like articles and expert analyses.
Always appreciate that. Keeps things interesting.
Yeah, and the question we're wrestling with is, what happens next in Ukraine?
Right. Especially with, Trump back in the White House. How does that impact everything?
Exactly, and we've got perspectives from all sides. Ukrainian officials, German politicians, military analysts. It's a lot to cover, so let's jump right in.
Makes you realize just how much this war touches everything, way beyond the actual fighting. Like it's reshaping global politics and alliances.
Totally, like we're at this turning point.
Yeah.
Speaking of unexpected turns, what about that whole situation with Germany? Schultz, their chancellor, had that phone call with Putin.
Oh, yeah. First one in, what, 2 years?
Yeah, almost 2 years.
Ah.
And it caused a huge uproar, especially with Zelensky, Ukraine's president.
Makes sense, right? From the Kremlin's perspective, it's a win. I mean, Putin's talking to a big European leader like Schultz. Makes him look powerful on the world stage, even with all the international pressure.
Zelensky didn't hold back, though. Straight up said, all you get from Putin is lies.
Yeah, I saw that.
He's really worried about it, like it could lead back to those failed peace agreements from, like, a decade ago.
Oh, like the Minsk agreements?
Yeah, he even called it a potential Minsk III situation.
Yeah.
Clearly wants to avoid that path.
You can see why he's on edge with all that history. Those Minsk agreements, they were supposed to bring a ceasefire and some political solutions back in 2014, 2015.
Right.
But they both fell apart. Constant fighting, both sides blaming each other for breaking the agreements.
Just like a bad memory they don't want to relive.
Exactly.
So thinking long term, how does this affect Ukraine's relationships, with Germany and other European partners? Can they stay united against Russia while also dealing with their own problems back home?
It's a tough balancing act for sure. And speaking of tough situations, we got to talk about Trump's re-election and what that means for this whole conflict. Zelensky saying the war will end faster with Trump back. That raised some eyebrows.
It's confusing, right? Considering Trump's past views on NATO and Putin, I would thought it'd be the opposite.
On the surface, yeah, it's surprising, but think about it from Zelensky's side. Trump, he likes quick solutions, even if it means deals that don't benefit everyone. Zelensky's probably worried that Ukraine will be pressured into a peace deal that involves giving up land, even if it hurts.
Makes sense. And Robert English, that former Pentagon policy analyst, he's predicting exactly that Trump will push Ukraine to give up the areas Russia's already taken.
Interesting. But then you've got Colonel Daniel Davis, the military expert, saying Trump's priority will be a ceasefire right away, then negotiations.
So many different opinions. Like during the campaign, Trump said he'd end the war in a day. Then you have experts saying that's just not realistic. This situation's way too complicated. So where does Ukraine fit into all of this, strategy-wise? They seem to be shifting their message, not so focused on getting back all their territory, more on getting strong security guarantees. What do you make of that?
It's a reality check, I think. Ukraine's taking heavy losses, and they're worried Western support might fade with Trump in charge. They have to redefine what winning looks like, focusing on what's actually achievable, securing their future, even if it's not the perfect outcome.
Yeah. There's a lot of anxiety about any ceasefire, though, especially given, Russia's track record, breaking those Minsk agreements. Can you blame Ukraine for being hesitant?
Not at all. Trying to make peace while a war's still going on is incredibly hard. Right now, Russia has the upper hand. Any talks, they're probably going to demand a lot from Ukraine.
It's a pretty grim picture, isn't it? Ukraine's being pressured to negotiate from both sides, Russia and maybe even their own allies. The West seems tired of the war, looking for a way out. And Putin, well, he probably sees this as a chance to solidify his gains.
It's a messy situation, that's for sure. But even with all that, you got to remember how resilient Ukraine has been throughout this whole thing. They've defied expectations over and over again, adapting to whatever gets thrown at them.
That's true. Their spirit is incredible.
Yeah.
But even so, it feels like their options are shrinking. A new U.S. president, questions about Western support. It all adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly difficult situation.
And it brings us back to Zelensky's comment about Trump maybe speeding up the end of the war. Is that just wishful thinking? Or is he trying to use Trump's desire for a quick win to get the best possible outcome for Ukraine?
It's a risky strategy, no doubt. And it makes you wonder, What does a win for Ukraine even look like at this point?
Yeah.
Is a real lasting peace even possible in all this chaos?
Those are the questions everyone's asking, and unfortunately, the answers aren't clear yet.
We've spent a lot of time talking politics and diplomacy, but what about what's happening on the ground? How's the actual fighting going?
Eastern Ukraine. It's still a powder keg. Russia's pushing forward, but slower than before. Ukrainian forces are holding their own in some places, but they're struggling. Not enough manpower, not enough equipment.
And the casualties on both sides, it's devastating. Just adds to the urgency of finding some kind of peace.
Yeah, the human cost of this war is it's immense. Millions displaced from their homes, cities destroyed, and the trauma, that'll last for generations.
It's heartbreaking. Makes you realize the responsibility on those negotiating for peace. Every decision weighs so heavy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so back to Germany for a second. We talked about that Schultz-Putin call and the pressure Schultz is facing back home. What does this mean for Germany's role in the conflict moving forward? Will they keep supporting Ukraine as strongly as they have been?
That's the big question mark. Right now, they're the second largest supporter, just after the U.S. But with those elections coming up and people getting more and more unhappy about the cost of this war, well, who knows?
Especially with those populist parties, the AfD and Die Linke. They're taking advantage of all that anxiety, pushing for Germany to step back from the conflict.
Exactly. They're tapping into that desire for peace and stability, saying that supporting Ukraine threatens that.
And that message is resonating with a lot of voters. What's even more worrying is that these parties have a history of being pro-Russia.
Yeah, not a good sign. Makes you wonder, if Germany's policy changes, could it embolden Putin? Could it weaken the West? These are really important questions that leaders across Europe are grappling with.
It shows how domestic politics and international relations are all tangled up, doesn't it?
Definitely. Scholz is trying to do what's best for Germany while also supporting Ukraine and the Western alliance. Not an easy position to be in.
So it seems like we've uncovered a ton of interconnected challenges and uncertainties about the future of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, we've touched on a lot, how Ukraine's priorities are changing, all the political maneuvering in Europe, the anxiety about a ceasefire, and of course the big question mark of U.S. involvement with Trump back in the picture.
And all this is happening at such a critical time. It's no wonder there's so much unease and uncertainty about what's to come.
You said it. It's like we're trying to untangle this massive web. It's not just geopolitics. It's affecting everyday people, even in countries nowhere near the actual fighting.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. Speaking of interconnectedness, let's zoom in on Ukraine again. We've talked about their shift towards focusing on security guarantees. What are their officials actually saying?
Well, there have been some interesting statements from high-ranking people giving us a peek into their evolving strategy. For example, the chairman of the Defense and Intelligence Committee in Ukraine's parliament, he said, and I quote, "Talks should be based on guarantees for Ukraine. Nothing is more important." Another senior official echoed that sentiment, saying that while territory is important, the top priority should be getting real, enforceable security commitments for Ukraine.
So it sounds like they're moving away from this all-or-nothing approach to reclaiming territory and instead adopting a more pragmatic view of protecting their future, which begs the question, what would these security guarantees actually look like, and who would be responsible for providing them?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The specifics are still up in the air. Some analysts suggest a demilitarized zone along the current front lines, a long-term agreement preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, maybe even an international peacekeeping force deployed to the region.
Wow, that's a lot to consider.
Right. But getting Russia to agree to any of that and then finding countries willing to enforce those guarantees, that's a whole other challenge.
Especially with Trump in the White House now, given his previous skepticism about sending military aid to Ukraine, is there a chance he might use that as leverage to force Zelensky into a deal that's not really in Ukraine's best interest?
It's a real possibility that's causing a lot of anxiety in Kyiv. They know their fate is basically in Trump's hands now.
It's not just military aid either, is it? Trump has also expressed a willingness to talk directly to Putin, maybe bypassing traditional diplomatic channels. That could leave Ukraine out of the conversation about their own future.
Definitely.
It's almost like 2016 all over again, the whole world holding its breath, not sure what to expect from a Trump presidency.
The parallels are there, that's for sure. It's a lot of uncertainty for the international community to navigate with Trump calling the shots.
Speaking of uncertainty, let's not forget the deep skepticism many Ukrainians feel about any kind of ceasefire, especially with Russia's history of breaking agreements, like what happened with the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 2015. What's stopping them from doing it again?
That's a valid concern. Negotiating peace while the war is still raging is just incredibly difficult. As long as Russia is on the offensive, they hold all the cards, and as we've discussed, they're likely to demand major concessions from Ukraine.
So when we connect all these different threads, it paints a pretty bleak picture. Ukraine facing pressure to negotiate from both sides, the West seemingly tired of the war and wanting a way out, and Putin potentially sensing a chance to cement his gains.
It's a complex and concerning situation, no doubt. But even with all the doom and gloom, we have to remember how incredibly resilient Ukraine has been throughout this whole conflict. They've defied expectations time and again, showing a remarkable ability to adapt to whatever gets thrown their way.
True, their spirit and determination have been truly inspiring.
Absolutely.
But even so, it feels like their options are dwindling. The change in U.S. leadership and the big question mark over continued Western support just adds another layer of complexity to an already dire situation.
Which brings us back to Zelensky's comment about Trump potentially speeding up the end of the war. Is it just wishful thinking? Or is he trying to play on Trump's desire for a quick win to get the best possible outcome for Ukraine?
It's a high-stakes gamble, that's for sure. And it makes you wonder, what does a win for Ukraine even look like at this point? Is a truly just and lasting peace even achievable under these circumstances?
Those are the questions everyone's grappling with, and unfortunately, the answers aren't clear yet.
We've been focusing a lot on the political and diplomatic side of things. But what about what's happening on the ground? How's the actual conflict playing out on the battlefield?
Eastern Ukraine is still extremely volatile. It's a powder keg, ready to explode. Russia is still advancing, though not as quickly as before. Ukrainian forces are managing to hold their ground in some areas, but they're constantly struggling with shortages of manpower and equipment.
And there are reports of devastating casualties on both sides, which just adds to the urgency of finding a path to peace.
Absolutely. The human cost of this war is staggering and cannot be ignored. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, cities, and crucial infrastructure lie in ruins, and the psychological scars of this conflict will likely last for generations.
It's a heartbreaking reality, and it just underscores the immense weight of responsibility on those involved in any future peace negotiations.
Every decision made in the coming weeks and months carries profound consequences, not only for Ukraine, but for the global order as a whole.
So let's shift gears back to Germany again.
Yeah.
We've talked about Scholz's controversial call with Putin and the pressure he's facing domestically. But what does all this mean for Germany's role in the conflict going forward? Will they continue to be a strong supporter of Ukraine?
It's tough to say. Right now, they're the second largest supporter of Ukraine, just behind the U.S. But with those upcoming elections and the growing public discontent over the war's economic and social costs, who knows if that level of support can be sustained?
Especially with those populist parties, the AfD and Die Linke, using people's fears and advocating for a less involved approach to the conflict.
Exactly. They're appealing to that deep desire for peace and stability, framing continued support for Ukraine as a threat to those values.
It's a powerful message that's resonating with a significant portion of the German electorate. And what's really concerning is that these parties have a history of pro-Russian sentiment.
That's a red flag. It raises serious questions about the potential consequences of a shift in German policy. Could it embolden Putin? Could it fracture Western unity? These are crucial questions that leaders all across Europe are grappling with.
This situation really highlights the complex relationship between domestic politics and international relations.
It does. Scholz is walking a tightrope. He's trying to balance the needs of his own country with the needs of Ukraine and the Western alliance. It's a tough act, and it's attracting a lot of scrutiny and criticism.
So we're at the midway point of our deep dive, and it seems like we've uncovered a lot of interconnected challenges and uncertainties about the future of the war in Ukraine.
We have. We've explored how Ukraine's priorities are evolving, the political maneuvering happening in Europe, the anxiety surrounding a potential ceasefire, and of course, that big question mark hanging over U.S. involvement with Trump back in charge.
And all these factors seem to be converging at a critical moment, creating a real sense of unease and uncertainty about what lies ahead.
Feels like we're at a real turning point here. So much uncertainty about what happens next, and the stakes are, well, incredibly high.
Yeah, it feels like every decision, every move could have huge ripple effects. So, going back to Zelensky's comment about the war maybe ending faster with Trump, we've touched on it, but I'm still trying to process it. What are your thoughts?
It's a statement that sparked a lot of debate, that's for sure. It really depends on what Trump's actual goals are. Does he really think he can create lasting peace? Or is he just looking for a quick way out, no matter what it means for Ukraine?
That's the big question, right? And what does he actually have to work with to influence the situation? We know he's expressed doubts about Western military aid to Ukraine in the past. Could he use that to pressure Zelensky into a deal that's not good for Ukraine?
It's a possibility that's definitely causing a lot of anxiety in Kyiv. They're very aware that their future is heavily tied to Trump's decisions.
And it's not just about the military aid either. We can't forget that Trump has also shown he's willing to talk direct to Putin, maybe even going around the usual diplomatic channels. That could make it even harder for Ukraine to have a voice in what happens to them.
Definitely a concern. It really speaks to that broader uncertainty around Trump's foreign policy. He's known for being unpredictable, doing things his own way. It makes it really hard for other leaders, like Zelensky, to figure out what he's going to do next or how to work with him.
It's almost like we're back in 2016 with the whole world watching and waiting, trying to understand what a Trump presidency means for everything.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. Having Trump back in charge creates a lot of uncharted territory for the international community. You can feel the apprehension.
So where does this leave Ukraine? Stuck in the middle of all this geopolitical maneuvering, pressure coming from all sides, and their future hanging in the balance. What's the best move for them right now?
That's the million-dollar question Zelensky and his team are trying to answer, and there are no easy answers. They have to find a way to balance what's best for Ukraine with the reality of a constantly changing global situation, and they have to do it fast.
Because the longer this war goes on, the higher the cost, in terms of lives lost, but also in their ability to rebuild.
Exactly. It emphasizes how urgent it is to find a path to peace, even if that path is difficult and full of obstacles.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Given the shifting political landscape, the changing priorities in Kyiv, and all the uncertainty around U.S. involvement now, what will peace ultimately cost Ukraine? It's a question without easy answers, but it's one we should all be thinking about as we continue to follow this incredibly complex and ever-evolving conflict. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring all these different facets of the war in Ukraine. It's a situation that demands our attention and understanding.